The grand art gallery sparkled under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, a haven of refined elegance where the city's elite sauntered in designer suits and flowing gowns. Waiters in crisp uniforms navigated the room with trays of champagne flutes, while the faint hum of classical music provided a graceful backdrop to conversations dripping with art-world pretension. Detective Ray Maxwell stepped through the double doors, his well-worn trench coat and scuffed shoes marking him as a stranger in this world of luxury. He paused, taking in the scene with a practiced eye, his sharp gaze missing nothing. Maxwell didn't belong here, and he didn't care to. He was here for one reason: a murder. Julian Vance, the renowned art critic whose scathing reviews could make or break an artist's career, had been found dead in his private office at the gallery. The patrons murmured in hushed tones, their curiosity barely veiled behind faux concern. Maxwell pushed through the crowd, ignoring the judgmental glances thrown his way, until he reached the cordoned-off office. The room was a chaotic clash of clutter and deliberate placement. Art books and manuscripts were scattered across the shelves and desk, but Maxwell's trained eye immediately noticed that the disorder wasn't random. The books were arranged in a subtle pattern, as though someone wanted to send a message without making it obvious. Vance's body lay slumped near a painting on the far wall, a single stab wound to the chest marring his tailored suit. The painting caught Maxwell's attention, a desolate landscape, barren and eerie, utterly unlike the vibrant, avant-garde pieces usually associated with Vance's tastes. Something about it felt out of place, wrong, as if it didn't belong in this room or in this story. Maxwell's gaze shifted to the desk, where a small, bright blue feather rested incongruously amid the chaos. He picked it up carefully, holding it to the light. It was delicate, yet its color was so vivid it seemed almost unnatural. The feather wasn't from any bird he recognized, and its presence here felt deliberate, like a breadcrumb left by someone who wanted to be found, or someone who wanted to taunt him. Pocketing the feather, Maxwell straightened and turned to face the gallery owner, Evelyn Hayes. She stood just inside the doorway, her face pale and her hands trembling despite her attempt at composure. Evelyn was an elegant woman, her black dress tailored to perfection, but her red-rimmed eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. "I can't believe this is happening," Evelyn murmured, her voice cracking as she spoke. He was difficult, but he didn't deserve this. Maxwell studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions. Did Julian have enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" Her lips pressed into a thin line as she fought to maintain her calm facade. "Julian was a critic," she said finally. "He wasn't popular, exactly. But murder? No. I can't imagine anyone wanting to do this." Maxwell's gut told him she was holding something back. "You said he was difficult. What do you mean by that?" Evelyn hesitated, wringing her hands. "Lately, he'd been paranoid. Distrusting. He was obsessed with that painting." She gestured toward the desolate landscape. "He bought it a few weeks ago, out of the blue. It's not even from a well-known artist. He wouldn't stop talking about it, though. Said it was important." Maxwell glanced at the painting again, unease prickling at the back of his neck. "Important how?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wouldn't say." Maxwell nodded slowly, filing her words away. He had more questions for her, but he needed to dig deeper before pressing her further. He ordered a full sweep of the gallery, instructing his team to search for hidden cameras, listening devices, anything that might shed light on what had happened in this office. He also requested Vance's financial records, knowing that money often left a trail more damning than words. Back at the precinct, Maxwell pored over the records, his desk cluttered with printouts and notes. Vance's financial history revealed a series of large, unexplained transactions to an offshore account. The amounts were significant, and the timing coincided with his growing paranoia. Maxwell's suspicion deepened when he noticed a pattern. The transactions were all linked to a shadowy entity called Silent Wings. The name triggered a vague memory, something he couldn't quite place, but he knew it wasn't good. A quick search of police files confirmed his unease. Silent Wings was connected to a string of high-profile art thefts across Europe, a group that operated with surgical precision and left behind no evidence, except for a single blue feather at each scene. Maxwell pulled the feather from his pocket, turning it over in his hand. It was their calling card, unmistakable, and it meant Vance's death was part of something much larger than a personal grudge. The lab report on the feather arrived later that evening, revealing it belonged to a rare species of bird native to a remote region, the same region depicted in the desolate painting from Vance's office. Maxwell's instincts screamed that the painting was the key, a thread that would unravel the entire mystery if he could just follow it far enough. The next morning, he packed a bag and boarded a plane, determined to see the place for himself. The remote location was as bleak and haunting as the painting had suggested. Maxwell found himself standing before an abandoned cabin, its weathered wood and shattered windows a testament to years of neglect. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Maxwell's hand hovered near his holster as he stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The cabin was a time capsule of secrets. Sketches of paintings littered the floor, alongside handwritten notes detailing transactions and names. One word appeared repeatedly: Silent Wings. In a hidden compartment behind a false wall, Maxwell discovered a cache of stolen artifacts, paintings, sculptures, and rare manuscripts, all worth millions. But the real treasure lay in a small, leather-bound journal tucked inside one of the frames. Its pages were filled with meticulous records, names, dates, deals. At the center of it all was Evelyn Hayes. Maxwell returned to the city with a renewed sense of purpose. He confronted Evelyn at the precinct, laying the evidence before her. "You lied to me," he said, his voice cold. "You weren't just Julian's wife. You were his partner." Evelyn's calm facade cracked, her lips trembling as she struggled to maintain control. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "Julian betrayed me. He was going to take everything. And you killed him for it," Maxwell replied, his words a statement, not a question. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but there was no remorse in her gaze. "He was weak," she said bitterly. "He thought he could outsmart them. Outsmart me. I had no choice." Maxwell leaned back in his chair, the weight of her confession settling over him. "You always had a choice," he said quietly. "You just made the wrong one." As Evelyn was led away in handcuffs, Maxwell stared at the journal on his desk. It was a map of corruption and power, a web that stretched far beyond Julian Vance and Evelyn Hayes. Silent Wings wasn't just an organization, it was a shadow empire, and this was only the beginning. Maxwell knew he had pulled on a thread that would unravel more than he could imagine. The fight wasn't over. It never was. Maxwell stepped out of the precinct into the chill of the evening, the city's skyline a jagged silhouette against the dimming light. The journal weighed heavily in his hand, not just physically but with the implications it carried. Silent Wings wasn't just an art theft syndicate, it was a network of power, corruption, and control that reached higher than he initially thought. Evelyn Hayes was just the tip of the iceberg, a pawn who fancied herself a queen, but her betrayal and desperation were enough to give him a lead. For now, though, all he could do was follow the next thread. The name from the journal echoed in his mind as he walked to his car: Alexander Greaves. He was listed not once but several times as the recipient of transactions from Julian Vance's offshore accounts. Greaves wasn't a name Maxwell recognized, but the journal indicated he was a key player. His last known address was an upscale penthouse overlooking the river, a far cry from the abandoned cabin Maxwell had just returned from. He decided it was time for a visit. The building was as pretentious as Maxwell had expected: marble floors, gold accents, and a doorman who looked less than thrilled at the sight of a man in a rumpled trench coat. Maxwell flashed his badge and rode the elevator to the top floor, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun. Something about this felt off, but then, it always did. The penthouse was eerily quiet when he arrived. The door was unlocked, which was always a bad sign. Maxwell pushed it open cautiously, his gun drawn. The living room was immaculate, a study in modern luxury with minimalist furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. But the silence was deafening, and Maxwell's instincts screamed that he wasn't alone. He moved slowly through the apartment, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. The first thing he noticed was the smell, a faint metallic tang that he recognized all too well. Blood. His jaw tightened as he followed the scent to the study. There, slumped over a sleek mahogany desk, was Alexander Greaves. A single bullet hole marred his temple, and the blood pooling beneath him had begun to congeal. Maxwell cursed under his breath. Whoever had done this was tying up loose ends, and they were one step ahead of him. The study was pristine, as though someone had taken great care to clean up after themselves. But Maxwell knew better. No one could erase everything. He scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. His eyes landed on the computer, its screen dark but still warm to the touch. Someone had been here recently. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, a portable data extractor he'd started carrying for moments like this. Plugging it into the computer, he let it do its work while he continued to search the room. On the bookshelf, he found a hidden compartment, an amateur mistake for someone involved in something as big as Silent Wings. Inside was a slim folder containing several photographs. Maxwell flipped through them, his frown deepening with each one. They were surveillance shots, all of the same man, Julian Vance. Greaves had been watching him, but why? The device beeped, signaling that it had finished extracting the computer's data. Maxwell pocketed it and took one last look around the study. He didn't expect to find anything else, and he didn't want to stick around longer than necessary. Whoever had killed Greaves might still be close, and Maxwell wasn't in the mood to get ambushed. He left the penthouse as quietly as he had entered, his mind already racing with questions. Back at the precinct, Maxwell plugged the data extractor into his laptop. The files it had pulled from Greaves' computer were encrypted, but the IT department owed him a few favors. Within an hour, he had access to everything. Most of it was mundane, emails, financial records, but one folder stood out. It was labeled Project Horizon. Inside were dozens of documents, blueprints, and correspondence, all pointing to an upcoming event. Silent Wings wasn't just stealing and selling art, they were planning something bigger. One of the blueprints caught Maxwell's eye, a layout of the city's Museum of Modern Art. A gala was scheduled there in 2 days, a fundraiser for local artists that promised to draw the city's wealthiest patrons. If Silent Wings was targeting it, they weren't after money. They were after something much more valuable. Maxwell barely slept that night, his mind consumed by the pieces of the puzzle he was trying to assemble. By morning, he had a plan. He contacted Captain Harris, briefing him on what he'd found. Harris wasn't thrilled about Maxwell's hunches, but he knew better than to ignore them. The museum was placed under discreet surveillance, and Maxwell was given the green light to attend the gala undercover. The night of the gala arrived quickly. Maxwell traded his trench coat for a tailored suit, though he felt no less out of place among the city's elite. The museum was a glittering spectacle, every corner filled with art and opulence. Maxwell moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning every face, every gesture. He was looking for anything, or anyone, who seemed out of place. His attention was drawn to a woman standing near one of the exhibits, her posture too stiff, her gaze too calculating. She was dressed to blend in, but Maxwell recognized the telltale signs of someone who didn't belong. He approached her casually, striking up a conversation about the artwork. She played along, but her answers were clipped, her smile forced. Maxwell felt the tension radiating off her, and he knew he'd found his mark. Before he could press further, the lights in the museum flickered. A hush fell over the crowd as the power cut out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Maxwell's hand went instinctively to his gun as a voice echoed through the room, amplified by a hidden speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice said, calm and composed. "Tonight, you will witness history." The lights came back on, but the atmosphere had shifted. A group of masked individuals stood at the entrance, armed and blocking the only way out. The crowd murmured in fear, but the masked leader raised a hand, silencing them. "We are Silent Wings," the leader announced. "And this museum holds something that doesn't belong to your world. Tonight, we take it back." Maxwell's heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold. This wasn't just a heist, it was a statement. And he was right in the middle of it. He slipped away from the crowd, moving toward the exhibit the masked group seemed most interested in. It was a painting, ancient, unassuming, but clearly significant to Silent Wings. Maxwell didn't know why it mattered, but he wasn't about to let them take it. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. Maxwell confronted one of the masked individuals, disarming them with practiced efficiency. The crowd panicked, scattering in every direction as the confrontation escalated. Security guards joined the fray, but they were no match for Silent Wings' precision and planning. Maxwell fought his way toward the leader, determined to put an end to this. The leader saw him coming and smirked beneath their mask. "Detective Maxwell," they said, their voice dripping with mockery. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long." Maxwell didn't respond. He lunged, tackling the leader to the ground as gunfire erupted around them. The leader was strong, but Maxwell was fueled by adrenaline and a relentless need for answers. He ripped the mask off, revealing a face he recognized all too well. It was someone he hadn't expected, someone who'd been pulling the strings from the very beginning. The face beneath the mask froze Maxwell in place. It was someone he thought he'd buried deep in his past, Sebastian Cain, a former police officer turned criminal mastermind. Cain had disappeared years ago, presumed dead after a disastrous undercover operation. Maxwell had worked with him once, trusted him even, but now here he was, alive and at the center of the chaos Maxwell had been unraveling. "Surprised, Ray?" Cain sneered, his voice dripping with venom. His smirk was maddeningly self-assured, even as Maxwell kept him pinned to the ground. Around them, the museum was a cacophony of shouting and gunfire, but Maxwell only had eyes for Cain. "How?" Maxwell growled, his grip tightening on Cain's collar. "How are you here?" "You were dead." "Dead to you, maybe," Cain spat, his smirk unwavering. "But dead men have a way of finding new opportunities. Silent Wings gave me something the Force never could, freedom." Maxwell's mind raced, piecing together the implications. Cain wasn't just a pawn in Silent Wings, he was a central figure, maybe even the architect of the operation. The journal, the feather, the stolen art, it all led back to him. And now, here he was, taunting Maxwell with his survival. Before Maxwell could respond, a sharp pain shot through his side. One of Cain's accomplices had blindsided him, slamming the butt of a rifle into his ribs. Maxwell rolled off Cain with a grunt, clutching his side as Cain scrambled to his feet. The accomplice pulled Cain toward the exit, but not before Cain turned back to Maxwell with a parting shot. "It's bigger than you, Ray," he called, his voice ringing out above the chaos. "You'll never stop it." Maxwell pushed himself up, his vision swimming but his resolve unshaken. He wasn't about to let Cain slip through his fingers again. Ignoring the pain in his side, he gave chase, weaving through the panicked crowd and dodging the masked assailants who tried to block his path. Cain and his accomplice were heading for a service exit, but Maxwell was gaining on them. As they reached the door, Cain turned and fired a shot, the bullet grazing Maxwell's shoulder. He stumbled but kept going, his focus razor-sharp. The chase spilled out into the back alley, where the city's neon glow cast stark shadows against the brick walls. Cain was fast, but Maxwell was relentless. He tackled Cain to the ground once more, wresting the gun from his hand and pinning him with all the strength he could muster. "This ends now," Maxwell hissed, his voice low and deadly. Cain laughed, even as blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. "You think you've won? You don't even know what game you're playing." Maxwell's jaw clenched. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" But before Cain could answer, the roar of an engine filled the alley. A black van screeched to a halt, and more masked figures poured out, weapons drawn. Maxwell cursed under his breath. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and Cain knew it. Catch me if you can, Kane taunted as his accomplices pulled him from Maxwell's grasp and shoved him into the van. The tires screeched as the vehicle sped off, leaving Maxwell in the dust. He slammed his fist into the pavement, frustration boiling over. Kane had slipped through his fingers again, and now Silent Wings was more dangerous than ever. But Maxwell wasn't about to give up. He had a face, a name, and a history to work with. Kane's arrogance would be his downfall, and Maxwell would make sure of it. Back at the precinct, Maxwell pored over the data he'd extracted from Greaves' computer, hoping to find anything that could give him an edge. The files on Project Horizon were incomplete, but they hinted at something massive, a convergence of power players, all tied to Silent Wings. The gala had been a diversion, a way to test their strength and send a message. Whatever their true goal was, it was still looming, and Maxwell was running out of time to stop it. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the case pressing down on him. Kane's words echoed in his mind, "It's bigger than you, Ray." He didn't doubt that for a second, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Silent Wings had operated in the shadows for too long, and now that he'd seen their face, Kane's face, he couldn't let it go. The journal sat on his desk, its leather cover worn and cracked. Maxwell flipped through it again, focusing on the names he hadn't yet investigated. One name stood out, Victoria Lang, a high-profile art dealer with a reputation for working with selective clients. If anyone could give him insight into Silent Wings' operations, it was her. The next morning, Maxwell paid her a visit at her gallery, a sleek, modern building that exuded wealth and exclusivity. Lang greeted him with a practiced smile, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of his appearance. "Detective Maxwell," she said smoothly, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Maxwell didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need to talk to you about Silent Wings." Lang's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Maxwell said, his tone cold. "Your name is all over their financial records. You've been brokering deals for them, haven't you?" Lang's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Maxwell thought she might deny it again. But then she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "You don't understand what you're getting into, detective," she said quietly. "Silent Wings isn't just about art. It's about power. Influence. They have their hands in everything." "Then help me stop them," Maxwell said, his voice firm. "Tell me what you know." Lang hesitated, her gaze darting toward the gallery's security cameras. "If I talk, they'll come after me. After everyone I care about." "They're going to come after you anyway," Maxwell said bluntly. "The only way to protect yourself is to help me take them down." For a long moment, Lang said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded. "There's a meeting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow night. An auction. They're planning to sell something big, something that could shift the balance of power in the city." "What are they selling?" Maxwell asked. Lang hesitated again, then leaned in closer. "Not what?" "Who?" Maxwell's blood ran cold. Silent Wings wasn't just dealing in stolen art, they were trafficking people. And now, he had less than 24 hours to stop them. Maxwell left the gallery with Lang's words reverberating in his mind, "Not what?" "Who?" The implications hit him like a freight train. Silent Wings wasn't just an art theft syndicate, they were trafficking people, leveraging human lives as commodities in their twisted pursuit of power and influence. The notion sickened him, but it also sharpened his resolve. He had less than 24 hours to locate the auction and shut it down, and failure wasn't an option. Back at the precinct, Maxwell wasted no time. He called in every favor he was owed, rallying a small team of trusted officers who could operate under the radar. Silent Wings clearly had connections in high places, and Maxwell wasn't about to risk tipping them off by going through official channels. He shared what little information he had about the auction, tomorrow night, location unknown, but likely tied to one of the city's elite venues. The team quickly began cross-referencing Lang's vague details with recent rental permits, private event bookings, and any other leads that might narrow down the possibilities. Hours ticked by with little progress, the weight of the deadline pressing down on everyone. Maxwell's frustration mounted as the search yielded nothing concrete. It wasn't until late in the evening, when one of the team members burst into the room holding a tablet, that a sliver of hope emerged. "I think I've got something," the officer said, handing the tablet to Maxwell. "An unused warehouse down by the docks. It's owned by a shell company that's been flagged in connection with offshore accounts, same accounts tied to Julian Vance and Silent Wings." Maxwell's eyes scanned the report, his pulse quickening. The warehouse was isolated, surrounded by shipping containers and industrial machinery, the perfect spot for an illicit operation to unfold unnoticed. And the timing matched. The space had been reserved for a private event scheduled for tomorrow night. "This is it," Maxwell said, his voice firm. "This has to be where they're holding the auction." The team sprang into action, coordinating a plan to raid the warehouse. Maxwell knew they'd be walking into a hornet's nest. Silent Wings wasn't going to let their operation go down without a fight. But he also knew they couldn't afford to wait. Every second they delayed was another second that innocent lives were at risk. As the team finalized their preparations, Maxwell pulled Lang aside for one last conversation. She'd agreed to cooperate, but he could see the fear etched across her face. "You've done the right thing," Maxwell said, his tone softer than usual. "But I need to know, how many people are we looking at? How many lives are on the line?" Lang hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know the exact number," she admitted. "But it's not just local. Silent Wings has been bringing in people from overseas. They're auctioning them off to the highest bidder, like they're nothing more than property." The disgust in her voice mirrored the revulsion Maxwell felt in his gut. "That ends tomorrow," he said, his voice steely. "No matter what it takes." The following night, the team gathered near the docks under the cover of darkness. The warehouse loomed ahead, its corrugated metal walls illuminated by the faint glow of floodlights. From their vantage point, Maxwell could see black SUVs and luxury cars parked outside, their drivers standing guard while the city's elite filed inside. It was a stark contrast, wealth and privilege colliding with the grim reality of human suffering. Maxwell issued final instructions to his team, their faces grim but determined. "We move in quietly. No unnecessary risks. Our priority is getting those people out safely. And if you see Kane," he paused, his jaw tightening, "bring him to me." The team nodded, and Maxwell led the charge. They approached the warehouse with military precision, using the shadows to their advantage. As they reached the building, Maxwell signaled for two officers to cover the main entrance while he and the others slipped around the side. The faint hum of voices filtered through the walls, growing louder as Maxwell found an unlocked side door and eased it open. The scene inside was worse than he'd imagined. The cavernous space had been transformed into a grotesque parody of an auction house. Spotlights illuminated a makeshift stage, where men and women stood in chains, their expressions vacant and hollow. Silent Wings operatives moved through the crowd, clipboard-wielding facilitators who treated the captives as inventory. The bidders sat in rows, their polished appearances and calm demeanor at odds with the horrors unfolding before them. Maxwell's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay focused. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto Kane near the stage. The former cop was in his element, orchestrating the event with an air of smug authority. Maxwell's hands tightened around his gun as he whispered into his radio, "We've got eyes on the target. Move in on my signal." The team positioned themselves strategically around the room, waiting for Maxwell's command. He counted down in his head, adrenaline surging through his veins. 3, 2, 1. Go! Maxwell barked into the radio, and all hell broke loose. The team stormed the warehouse, shouting commands as chaos erupted. Bidders scrambled for the exits, their polished facades shattering as they pushed and shoved in their desperation to escape. Silent Wings operatives drew their weapons, engaging in a fierce firefight with Maxwell's team. The captives on stage cowered, some screaming, others too numb to react. Maxwell fought his way through the chaos, his sights locked on Kane. The former cop spotted him and bolted, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. Maxwell pursued him, dodging bullets and shoving past panicked onlookers. The chase led them to a back corridor, where Kane turned and fired. The shot missed, but it was enough to slow Maxwell down. "You should have stayed out of this, Ray," Kane called over his shoulder, his voice laced with derision. "You don't know what you're messing with." Maxwell didn't bother responding. He rounded the corner just in time to see Kane slipping through a door that led to the docks. The cold night air hit Maxwell like a slap as he emerged outside, the sound of waves crashing against the pier filling his ears. Kane was heading for a speedboat, his escape route already planned. Not this time, Maxwell thought grimly. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he sprinted after Kane, tackling him just as he reached the boat. The two men hit the ground hard, grappling in a brutal struggle that left both of them bloodied and gasping for air. "You think this is justice?" Kane snarled, his hands clawing at Maxwell's throat. "You're just a pawn in their game, same as me." "Maybe," Maxwell shot back, his voice strained as he fought to break free. "But at least I'm still playing for the right side." With a final surge of effort, Maxwell overpowered Kane, slamming him against the ground. Sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of backup. Kane laughed bitterly, blood staining his teeth. "You think you've won?" he rasped. "Silent Wings isn't just a name, Ray. It's an idea. You can't kill an idea." Maxwell hauled Kane to his feet, his grip unrelenting. "Maybe not," he said coldly. "But I can sure as hell make you pay for yours." As officers swarmed the docks, taking Kane into custody and securing the captives, Maxwell allowed himself a moment to breathe. The night was over, but the war wasn't. Silent Wings was far from finished, and Maxwell knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. But for now, he'd take the small victory, a step forward in a fight that was far from over. Hours later, the warehouse was deserted except for the thin, acrid scent of gunpowder and the occasional shuffle of evidence technicians combing through the wreckage. Maxwell stood outside, leaning against a police cruiser, his face grim and his mind far from the scene. Kane had been hauled off in cuffs, his smugness intact even as he'd been shoved into the back of a squad car. The freed captives were receiving medical attention, the hollow look in their eyes serving as a brutal reminder of what Silent Wings had wrought. But Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not even close. Captain Harris approached, his footsteps crunching against the gravel. "Hell of a mess in there," he said, folding his arms as he surveyed the scene. "But you did good, Maxwell. We saved lives tonight." Maxwell didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked toward the docks, where the tide lapped against the pylons, indifferent to the chaos that had unfolded. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and edged with exhaustion. "We didn't get all of them." Harris sighed, his tone softening. "We got Kane. That's a big win." "He's just one piece," Maxwell muttered. "Silent Wings doesn't stop with him. He said it himself, it's bigger than we think." Harris regarded him for a moment, then clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Get some rest, Ray. You've earned it. We'll regroup tomorrow." Maxwell nodded absently, though he knew sleep wouldn't come easily. As Harris walked away, Maxwell pulled out the leather-bound journal, flipping through its pages for the 100th time. There were still names he hadn't followed up on, still threads left dangling. His gut told him that Silent Wings was regrouping even now, plotting their next move. The question was, how far did their influence reach, and how many more lives would be caught in their web before he could stop them? The next morning, Maxwell sat at his desk in the precinct, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Kane's interrogation had been scheduled for later that day, and Maxwell was determined to get answers. But first, he needed to prepare. He pored over the data from Greaves' computer, cross-referencing it with the names in the journal. One in particular caught his attention, Dr. Eleanor Stokes, a renowned historian and art authenticator. Her name appeared repeatedly in connection with Silent Wings, though her reputation in the art world had always been spotless. Maxwell tapped his pen against the desk, considering his next move. He'd learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, and he couldn't afford to overlook anyone connected to the syndicate. If Dr. Stokes was involved, she either knew more than she was letting on, or she was in deeper than she realized. By midday, Maxwell was standing in the lobby of a prestigious museum, waiting for Dr. Stokes to finish a lecture on Renaissance art. The walls were lined with priceless works, their beauty and history overshadowed by the weight of Maxwell's mission. When Stokes finally appeared, she was every bit the polished academic, graying hair pulled into a neat bun, glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, and an air of quiet authority that commanded respect. "Detective Maxwell," she said, her tone polite but wary. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Maxwell wasted no time. "Dr. Stokes, I need to ask you about Silent Wings." Her eyes flickered with something, fear. Recognition, before she quickly masked it. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." Maxwell stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Your name is all over their records. Transactions, consultations, appraisals. Either you're involved, or they're using you. Which is it?" Stokes hesitated, her composure faltering. She glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Not here," she whispered. "Follow me." She led him to her office, a cluttered but cozy space filled with books, sketches, and artifacts. Once the door was closed, she turned to face him, her expression grim. "I don't know how much you already know, detective, but if you've come this far, you're in dangerous territory." "Save the warnings," Maxwell said, crossing his arms. "Just tell me what you know." Stokes sighed, sinking into her chair. "Silent Wings approached me years ago. They needed someone with my expertise to authenticate rare pieces, forgeries, stolen artifacts, you name it. At first, I didn't ask questions. The money was substantial. But," Maxwell prompted, sensing there was more. "But I started noticing patterns," she admitted. "Certain pieces they brought to me had markings. Symbols. They weren't just stealing art, detective. They were looking for something ancient, something powerful." Maxwell frowned. "What kind of symbols?" Stokes opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, handing it to him. Inside were photographs of various artifacts, a painting, a carved stone, a fragment of a manuscript, all bearing the same intricate sigil. Maxwell traced the symbol with his finger, its shape unfamiliar but unsettling. "They believe it's part of a larger puzzle," Stokes explained. "A map, maybe. Or a key. Whatever it is, they think it will lead them to something valuable, something worth killing for." Maxwell's mind raced, connecting the dots. Silent Wings wasn't just trafficking art and people, they were hunting for something bigger. Something that could shift the balance of power in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his tone cautious. Stokes looked him in the eye, her voice steady but tinged with guilt. "Because I've seen what they're capable of. And because I know they won't stop until they get what they want." Maxwell nodded, pocketing the folder. "One last question. Do you know who's running it? Who's pulling the strings?" Stokes hesitated, then shook her head. "No. But there's someone they refer to as the curator. I've never met them, but Silent Wings answers to them. If you want to stop this, detective, you'll have to find the curator." Maxwell left the museum with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear, the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. Silent Wings wasn't just a criminal syndicate, it was a machine, and someone at the top was orchestrating its every move. If he wanted to dismantle it, he'd have to start at the source. Back at the precinct, Maxwell prepared for Kane's interrogation, determined to extract the truth. But as he entered the holding area, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. The cell was empty. Kane was gone. What the hell happened? Maxwell barked at the officer on duty. The officer looked pale, stammering as he spoke. "There was a transfer order. Signed by a judge. They said it was urgent, federal custody. Maxwell's fists clenched. It was a lie, a calculated move by Silent Wings to reclaim their asset. Kane had slipped through his fingers again, and now the game was more dangerous than ever. As he stood there, fury and determination warring within him, his phone buzzed with a message. It was a photo, grainy, taken in low light, but unmistakable. It showed Kane, sitting in the back of a car, smirking at the camera. Beneath it was a single line of text. "You're playing my game now, Ray." Maxwell stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Silent Wings had just made their next move, and it was personal. But they'd underestimated him. If they thought they could break him, they were wrong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Maxwell's grip tightened around the phone, his knuckles going white as the smirk on Kane's face mocked him from the screen. The message wasn't just a taunt, it was a declaration of war. Silent Wings wanted him to know they were still in control, still a step ahead. But Maxwell wasn't about to let them keep the upper hand. Kane's escape only deepened his resolve. If Silent Wings thought they could intimidate him, they didn't know who they were dealing with. He stormed back to his desk, his mind racing. The federal custody story was a fabrication, but the speed and precision with which Kane had been extracted suggested a deeper level of influence. Silent Wings had someone, or multiple someones, embedded in the system, pulling strings to ensure their operations remained untouchable. Maxwell needed to find the leak before it derailed his investigation entirely. First, though, he had to chase the lead Stokes had given him, the curator. The name hung in his mind like a dark cloud, vague yet menacing. Whoever this person was, they were Silent Wings' puppet master, the one orchestrating the syndicate's every move. Maxwell doubted Kane was high enough in the hierarchy to be the curator. Kane was cunning, but he lacked the patience and subtlety required to helm an operation this intricate. No, the curator was someone else, someone far more dangerous. Maxwell pulled out the folder Stokes had given him, laying the photographs of the artifacts across his desk. The symbols etched into each piece were unlike anything he'd seen before, intricate and ancient. He grabbed his phone and snapped pictures of the images, then sent them to a contact who specialized in cryptography and historical linguistics, Professor Alan Drake, an old friend he trusted implicitly. Within minutes, his phone buzzed. It was a call from Drake. "Ray," Drake said, his voice tinged with curiosity and concern. "Where did you get these?" "Long story," Maxwell replied. "Can you tell me what they are?" Drake hesitated. "They're unusual. This isn't just random symbology, it's deliberate. These markings show elements of ancient cartography, but they're layered with codes. Whoever made this wasn't just creating art, they were embedding information." "Information about what?" Maxwell pressed. "That's the million-dollar question," Drake said. "But if I had to guess, I'd say it's a map. Or at least part of one. If you can get me more context, I might be able to narrow it down." Maxwell thanked him and hung up, his mind already spinning with possibilities. A map. It fit with what Stokes had said about Silent Wings searching for something. But what could be so valuable, so important, that they'd build an entire criminal empire around finding it? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his desk. Captain Harris stood there, his expression grim. "Ray," Harris said, his voice low. "We've got a problem." Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "Just one?" "That's a relief." Harris didn't smile. He handed Maxwell a manila folder. Inside were photographs of a crime scene, a grisly one. A man lay slumped over a desk, a bullet hole in his forehead, blood pooled beneath him. Maxwell recognized the face instantly. It was one of the names from the journal. "David Langston," Harris said. "Art dealer. He was found in his office this morning. Execution style." Maxwell's stomach churned. Langston had been on his list of people to question about Silent Wings. Now, it seemed, the syndicate was cleaning house. "They're covering their tracks," Maxwell said, his voice tight with frustration. Anyone who knows too much is a target. Harris nodded. Which means you're probably next. The words hung in the air like a warning bell, but Maxwell shrugged them off. Let them come. I'm not going anywhere. Still, the growing body count was a stark reminder of just how high the stakes had become. Silent Wings wasn't just ruthless, they were efficient. And if Maxwell didn't move quickly, he risked losing every lead he had. He spent the next few hours piecing together what little information he could. Langston's death confirmed that Silent Wings was systematically silencing anyone who could expose them. But one name in the journal still stood out, Victoria Lang. She'd helped him before, but now he wasn't sure if she was a potential ally or another loose end waiting to be tied off. Throwing on his coat, Maxwell headed for Lang's gallery. The streets were unusually quiet, the city's usual hum dampened by an overcast sky that threatened rain. When he arrived, the gallery's lights were on, but the door was locked. Maxwell knocked, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. After a tense moment, Lang appeared, her face pale and drawn. "Detective," she said, unlocking the door and ushering him in. "I wasn't expecting you." "David Langston's dead," Maxwell said bluntly. "And I'm guessing you're next on their list." Lang's eyes widened, and she sank into a chair, her composure crumbling. "I told you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I told you they wouldn't stop." Maxwell crouched in front of her, his tone firm but not unkind. "Then help me stop them. Tell me everything you know about the curator." Lang hesitated, her gaze darting toward the gallery's windows as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. Finally, she spoke. "I've never met the curator," she admitted. "But I've heard things. They're not just a leader, they're a collector. Everything Silent Wings does is about acquiring power, influence, knowledge. The artifacts, the trafficking, it's all part of some larger plan." "What plan?" Maxwell demanded. "I don't know," Lang said, frustration and fear mingling in her voice. "But I've seen glimpses. The artifacts, they're connected to something ancient, something people have been searching for centuries. The curator believes it's the key to, I don't know, control? Immortality? Something bigger than any of us." Maxwell stood, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was still unclear. One thing was certain, though, the curator wasn't just a criminal mastermind. They were a zealot, driven by a vision that transcended greed. "Do you know where to find them?" Maxwell asked. Lang shook her head. "No. But if you follow the map, it might lead you to them." Maxwell's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was Drake, calling again. He answered, his voice terse. "What VE you got?" "I've been digging into those symbols," Drake said. "And I think I know where the map leads. It's a site, an excavation in Eastern Europe that was abandoned decades ago. Rumor has it, there's something buried there. Something people have killed for." Maxwell's grip tightened on the phone. "Send me everything you have." As Drake rattled off the details, Maxwell's resolve hardened. Silent Wings wasn't stopping, and neither was he. The game had changed, but the rules remained the same: find the truth, no matter the cost. The curator had made their move. Now, it was his turn. The sound of rain began to tap against the windows of the gallery as Maxwell ended the call with Drake. His mind was already racing ahead, planning his next move. Eastern Europe. An abandoned excavation site. It sounded like something out of a spy novel, but Maxwell had long since stopped doubting the lengths Silent Wings was willing to go to for their elusive prize. Whatever was buried there, it was the key to unraveling the syndicate and bringing the curator into the light. Victoria Lang was watching him, her fear palpable. "You're going after them, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell nodded as he pocketed his phone. "If what Drake found is right, this excavation is tied to the curator. If I can get there before they do, or before they dig up whatever they're looking for, I might have a chance to stop them." Lang's expression darkened. You don't understand. If you get too close to the curator, they'll destroy you. They destroy everyone who tries. Yeah, well, they've been trying to destroy me for weeks, Maxwell said, his voice hard. I'm still standing. Lang looked like she wanted to argue but thought better of it. Instead, she crossed the room to her desk and opened a drawer. She pulled out a small flash drive and held it out to Maxwell. What's this? He asked, taking it. Insurance, she said. It's everything I've ever collected on Silent Wings. Names, transactions, meeting locations, most of it is outdated, but there might be something in there that helps you. I was saving it in case I ever needed leverage, but I think it'll do more good in your hands. Maxwell didn't hesitate. He slipped the flash drive into his pocket. This might have just saved lives, he said. Including yours. Lang gave a bitter smile. For now. Maxwell left the gallery, stepping out into the rain. The city felt colder, emptier than usual, though maybe that was just the weight of what he was about to do. He didn't have the resources of Silent Wings or the luxury of time, but he had something they didn't, desperation, and a willingness to go wherever the trail led him. Back at the precinct, he plugged Lang's flash drive into his computer and began combing through the files. It was a treasure trove of information, emails, shipping manifests, bank records, even photos of Silent Wings operatives at various events. Most of it was years old, but a few names and locations stood out, particularly one, Viktor Krolov, a name that had popped up in both the Journal and Greaves financial records. Krolov was a known figure in the art black market, but he wasn't just a middleman. He was a facilitator, someone who handled logistics for high-stakes deals that required absolute discretion. If anyone could confirm Silent Wings' next move, or even point Maxwell closer to the curator, it was Krolov. Maxwell made a call to Captain Harris, filling him in on what he'd uncovered. I need clearance to leave the country, he said. Krolov's based in Prague, and the excavation site Drake mentioned is somewhere in that region. If I can get to him, I might be able to stop this before it goes any further. Harris sighed heavily. You're asking for a lot, Ray. I don't even know if I can get this approved. You don't have to approve it, Maxwell said. I'm going, with or without a stamp. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Harris finally relented. Fine. I'll push it through. But you better have something solid by the time you get back. Maxwell packed light, just the essentials, including a small recorder, his badge, and his gun. The flight to Prague felt interminable, though he used the time to pore over Lang's files and review Drake's findings. The excavation site was located in an isolated forest outside a small Czech village. According to the limited information Drake could find, it had been abandoned in the 1970s after a series of mysterious accidents. The locals called it Stracene Udoli, the Lost Valley. If Silent Wings believed there was something worth digging for there, it wasn't just any artifact. It was something that had been buried for a reason. When Maxwell landed in Prague, the city greeted him with its cobblestone streets and Gothic architecture, a striking contrast to the grim mission that had brought him there. He wasted no time, heading straight for Krolov's known hangout, a high-end bar hidden beneath a gallery in the Malostrana district. The bar was exactly what Maxwell expected, dimly lit, expensive, and full of people who didn't ask questions. Krolov was seated in a corner booth, surrounded by 2 bodyguards and a woman draped in furs. Maxwell approached, his badge tucked out of sight but his confidence radiating off him. Viktor Krolov, he said, sliding into the booth uninvited. We need to talk. Krolov's thin lips curved into a smile, though his eyes remained cold. And who are you, exactly? Maxwell leaned forward, his voice low and steady. I'm the guy who knows you've been working with Silent Wings. And I'm the guy who might let you walk out of here if you tell me what they're planning. The bodyguards shifted, their hands inching toward their weapons, but Krolov raised a hand to stop them. Silent Wings, he repeated, as if testing the words. A dangerous topic of conversation, my friend. So's murder, Maxwell shot back. And trafficking. And whatever the hell they're digging up in the Lost Valley. Krolov's smile faltered at that, his expression tightening. Maxwell had struck a nerve. I don't know what you're talking about, Krolov said, though his voice lacked conviction. Maxwell pulled out a photo from Lang's files, a grainy image of Krolov shaking hands with Kane. He slid it across the table. I think you do. For a moment, Krolov said nothing, his eyes darting between Maxwell and the photo. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling sharply. You're in over your head, detective. The curator, they're not someone you can stop. They've been planning this for decades. What are they planning? Maxwell pressed. Krolov hesitated, then lowered his voice to a whisper. The artifact they're looking for, it's not just a relic. It's a weapon. An ancient one. If they find it, they won't just control the art world. They'll control everything. Maxwell's stomach turned, though his expression remained unreadable. Where's the curator? Krolov shook his head. No one knows. They operate in shadows. But if you're going to the Lost Valley, he paused, his gaze darkening. Be prepared. You're not the only one looking for answers. Maxwell left the bar with more questions than he'd arrived with, but one thing was clear, he was running out of time. Whatever Silent Wings was planning, it was bigger than he'd imagined, and it was about to reach its climax. The Lost Valley was the next step, but it wouldn't just be him and Silent Wings there. Others were watching, waiting, and Maxwell was walking straight into the lion's den. The rain had followed him to Prague, and as he stepped into the street, it began to drizzle. Maxwell adjusted his coat, his jaw set. He'd come this far, and he wasn't stopping now. Silent Wings had made their move. It was time for him to make his. The rhythmic patter of rain accompanied Maxwell as he boarded the train heading eastward, leaving behind the ornate streets of Prague for the dense forests and rugged terrain that surrounded the Lost Valley. The train's dull hum provided a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his mind. Krolov's words haunted him, it's not just a relic. It's a weapon. Maxwell had seen greed and corruption before, but this was something else, a collision of ancient power and modern ambition, orchestrated by a ghostly figure no one seemed to truly know. The curator wasn't merely a criminal mastermind, they were something far more dangerous, a fanatic. Maxwell sat in a corner of the train car, his back to the wall and his eyes scanning the few passengers scattered throughout. Most were locals, dressed for the cold and oblivious to the storm about to unfold in their quiet corner of the world. He kept his gun holstered under his coat, his badge tucked away. If Silent Wings had operatives in the area, and they almost certainly did, he couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. As the train rumbled onward, the scenery outside shifted from rolling hills to dense thickets of pine trees. The Lost Valley was close now, its name weighing heavily on Maxwell's thoughts. He pulled out his phone and reviewed the map Drake had sent him. The excavation site was marked with a red pen, deep within the forest and accessible only by a treacherous dirt road. Maxwell had arranged for a rental jeep to be waiting at the station in the nearest village, but from there, it would be up to him to navigate the wilderness. The train screeched to a halt at a small station, the platform almost deserted. Maxwell stepped off, the chill of the air biting through his coat. The village was barely more than a cluster of cottages and shops, their windows glowing warmly against the gray sky. It seemed peaceful on the surface, but Maxwell knew better. Silent Wings had a way of infecting even the most remote places. He found the jeep waiting for him as promised, its tires already coated in mud from the unpaved roads. Maxwell climbed in and set off, the GPS guiding him toward the excavation site. The road was rough, the trees pressing in on either side like silent sentinels. As he drove deeper into the forest, a sense of unease settled over him. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. It felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath. An hour later, Maxwell reached the edge of the site. He parked the jeep a safe distance away and approached on foot, his movements careful and deliberate. The trees thinned out, revealing the remnants of the excavation, a series of trenches and pits dug into the earth, surrounded by rusted machinery and makeshift tents. The site looked abandoned at first glance, but Maxwell knew better than to trust appearances. He crouched behind a cluster of boulders, scanning the area with binoculars. Sure enough, there were signs of activity, fresh tire tracks in the mud, a generator humming faintly in the distance, and the faint glow of lights from one of the larger tents. Silent Wings was here. Maxwell's pulse quickened as he spotted figures moving near the largest pit. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks, and they moved with military precision. At least a dozen of them, maybe more. Armed, no doubt. This wasn't just an excavation, it was a fully secured operation. Maxwell's attention shifted to the pit itself. It was enormous, its edges reinforced with wooden beams to prevent collapse. At the bottom, he could just make out the faint outlines of something metallic and ancient, half buried in the dirt. Whatever it wasn't natural. The artifact, or weapon, Silent Wings had been searching for was almost within their grasp. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos, then sent them to Captain Harris with a brief message: "They're here. Need backup ASAP." But he knew it would take time for help to arrive, time he didn't have. If Silent Wings succeeded in extracting the artifact, they'd disappear before reinforcements could reach the site. Maxwell was on his own for now. Keeping low, he circled the perimeter of the site, looking for a way in. The guards were well trained, their patrols tight, but Maxwell had decades of experience outmaneuvering people like them. He spotted an opening near a cluster of abandoned equipment and slipped through, his movements silent and deliberate. He kept his gun drawn but lowered, ready to react at a moment's notice. The closer he got to the pit, the more he could hear, the murmur of voices, the low rumble of machinery, and the occasional barked order. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but the urgency in their tones was clear. They were close to unearthing whatever was buried here. Maxwell reached the edge of the pit and peered over. At the bottom, a team of workers was carefully clearing away the last layers of dirt, their movements precise and methodical. Standing above them was a figure that made Maxwell's blood run cold: Kane. The former cop looked completely at ease, his arms crossed and a smug grin on his face as he oversaw the operation. He was flanked by two heavily armed guards, their rifles slung across their chests. Maxwell's jaw tightened. Kane's escape had been orchestrated for this very moment, and now he was here, playing his part in the curator's grand design. Maxwell's radio crackled faintly in his ear, a secure channel linked to the transmitter he'd left in the Jeep. It was Captain Harris. "Maxwell, backup's en route, but it'll take at least an hour to reach you. What's your status?" Maxwell pressed a finger to his earpiece, keeping his voice low. "I'm at the site. Kane's here. They're digging up something big. Do not engage until backup arrives," Harris ordered. "You can't take them on alone." Maxwell didn't respond. He couldn't afford to wait. If he didn't act now, Silent Wings would vanish with whatever they were unearthing, and with Kane. He'd come too far to let that happen. Taking a deep breath, Maxwell assessed his options. He spotted a stack of fuel canisters near one of the tents, close enough to the pit to cause a distraction but far enough away to avoid harming the workers. If he could create chaos, it might give him the opening he needed to take Kane down and secure the artifact. Moving quickly but carefully, Maxwell made his way to the canisters. He pulled out a small lighter, a relic from his smoking days, and flicked it to life. With a silent prayer, he set the flame against the edge of a nearby tarp and watched as the fire began to spread. The explosion that followed was deafening, a fireball erupting into the night sky and sending shockwaves through the site. Guards shouted in confusion, their attention drawn away from the pit. Maxwell seized the moment, sprinting toward Kane with his gun raised. "Kane," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Kane turned, his grin faltering for the first time. "Maxwell," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Maxwell didn't waste time. He fired a shot, grazing Kane's shoulder and forcing him to stumble back. The guards raised their weapons, but Maxwell dove for cover, his movements quick and precise. The artifact was still in the pit, half buried and glowing faintly now, as if responding to the commotion. "This ends tonight, Kane," Maxwell shouted, his voice echoing through the chaos. But even as he said the words, he knew the fight was far from over. Silent Wings wasn't just a syndicate, it was a machine, and the curator was still out there, watching, waiting. Maxwell had set the stage for a confrontation that would either end the nightmare or consume him entirely. The explosion had turned the excavation site into a scene of chaos. Flames licked the edges of tents, casting sinister shadows across the forested clearing. Guards scrambled to contain the fire and locate the source of the attack, giving Maxwell the opening he needed. His breaths were steady, his grip tight around his gun as he moved closer to Kane. This moment had been a long time coming, and Maxwell wasn't leaving without answers or justice. Kane, clutching his bleeding shoulder, ducked behind a stack of crates near the pit. His smirk was gone, replaced by a grim determination. Maxwell could hear him barking orders to the remaining guards. "Find him. Don't let him get near the artifact." Maxwell pressed himself against the side of a rusted bulldozer, assessing his next move. The artifact loomed at the bottom of the pit, partially unearthed, its surface shimmering faintly in the firelight. It didn't look like a weapon, not in the conventional sense, but something about it felt wrong. The air around it seemed heavier, charged with an almost imperceptible hum. Whatever it was, Maxwell couldn't let Silent Wings take it. He spotted a guard moving toward his position and fired, the shot striking the man in the leg and sending him sprawling. More shouts erupted, and Maxwell knew his time was running out. Reinforcements would be closing in, and the odds were already stacked against him. "Kane," he shouted, stepping out from cover. "It's over. Whatever you're after, it ends here." Kane stood, his expression a mixture of pain and amusement. "You don't get it, do you, Ray?" he called back. "This isn't just about money or power. This is about legacy. The curator has seen the future, and you're not in it." Maxwell leveled his gun at Kane. "Drop the act and tell me where the curator is." Kane laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "You're chasing shadows, Maxwell. The curator doesn't reveal themselves to people like you. You're just a footnote in history." Before Maxwell could respond, a sudden movement caught his eye. One of the workers in the pit had uncovered the last section of the artifact, revealing a strange, circular device covered in intricate carvings. The hum grew louder, almost tangible now, and a faint blue light began to pulse from its center. "Step away from it," Maxwell shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the artifact's escalating vibration. Kane's eyes lit up with manic glee. "It's activating," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The curator was right. "It's real." Maxwell didn't hesitate. He fired a shot at the artifact, hoping to disable it, but the bullet ricocheted harmlessly off its surface. The blue light intensified, forming a swirling vortex that seemed to warp the air around it. The workers scrambled to escape the pit, terror etched across their faces. Kane turned to Maxwell, his bleeding shoulder forgotten. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than all of us." Maxwell advanced, his gun trained on Kane. "Then stop it. Shut it down." "I can't," Kane admitted, his bravado crumbling. "It's already begun." The vortex expanded, its energy whipping through the campsite like a hurricane. Tents were torn from their stakes, equipment toppled, and the guards who hadn't fled were left shielding their faces from the onslaught. Maxwell could feel the pull of the vortex, a force unlike anything he'd encountered before. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological, tugging at the edges of his mind, filling him with a deep, primal dread. "Where's the curator?" Maxwell demanded again, his voice barely audible over the roar of the artifact. Kane laughed, a hollow, desperate sound. "They're everywhere, Maxwell. And nowhere. You'll never stop them." Before Maxwell could react, Kane lunged toward the pit, his eyes fixed on the artifact. Maxwell fired, the bullet striking Kane in the leg and sending him crashing to the ground. But it was too late. The artifact's energy surged, the vortex collapsing inward with a deafening roar. For a moment, everything went still. The flames, the wind, the shouting, all of it ceased, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. Maxwell crouched, his gun still raised, his senses on high alert. The artifact sat dormant at the bottom of the pit, its light extinguished. Whatever had just happened, it was over. Or so he thought. A voice crackled in his earpiece, pulling him back to reality. "Maxwell, this is Harris. Backup's 5 minutes out. What's your status?" Maxwell exhaled, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "The artifact's been contained. Kane's down, but alive. Silent wings scattered." "Good work," Harris replied. "We'll secure the site and take it from here." Maxwell lowered his gun, his gaze lingering on the artifact. It didn't feel like a victory. Kane was right about one thing: this wasn't over. The curator was still out there, and whatever their plans were, this was only the beginning. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Maxwell turned his attention back to Kane, who lay on the ground, clutching his wounded leg. "You're going to prison," Maxwell said, his tone cold. "And you're going to tell me everything." Kane smiled weakly, blood staining his teeth. "You think this ends with me? The curator's already won. You just don't know it yet." Maxwell didn't respond. He hauled Kane to his feet and handed him off to the arriving officers. As they secured the site and began cataloging the evidence, Maxwell stood at the edge of the pit, staring down at the artifact. It seemed harmless now, but he knew better. This wasn't just a relic, it was a warning. Hours later, as he sat in the back of an unmarked car heading for the nearest safe house, Maxwell's phone buzzed. It was a text message, sent from an unknown number. The message was simple, but it sent a chill down his spine. "You stopped nothing. The curator watches." Maxwell stared at the words, his jaw tightening. Silent Wings might have been dealt a blow tonight, but the war was far from over. The curator was still out there, and Maxwell knew they'd strike again. But he'd be ready. He always was.